Amara's dream. Amara's small, calloused hands gripped the crumpled bills, as though they were treasures more precious than gold. The harsh folds of the bills seemed insignificant compared to the spark of determination in her eyes, a fire that reflected a promise she had made to herself. Today was the day her dream would finally come true. Her heart raced with excitement as she stood in the middle of the toy store, surrounded by vibrant displays that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The shelves, bursting with toys of every shape, size, and color, felt like a dreamscape, but Amara's focus was sharp. She had been waiting for this day for months, saving every penny she could find. From birthday money to spare change she found around the house, Amara had put every cent toward one single goal, a goal she had cherished quietly, determinedly, to buy a doll that looked just like her. The store was bustling, a swirl of activity and chatter as parents scurried to grab gifts and children raced through the aisles, pulling at their parents' sleeves with wide, pleading eyes. But Amara's gaze was fixed on a particular corner of the store, a section filled with dolls, each with blonde hair and blue eyes, each a reflection of a world that often seemed too far removed from hers. It had taken her a long time to find a doll that looked like her. Dark skin, tight curls, a representation of herself, someone who could be her friend in the world of imagination, a companion to join her in adventures. The doll she had set her eyes on was perfect. The deep brown skin, the bright yellow dress that radiated warmth, and the tight curls that matched her own. It wasn't just a toy to Amara. It was a symbol of self-worth, a validation in a world that often told her she was different, that she didn't quite belong. Her mother, Cynthia, stood nearby, quietly watching her daughter. Her expression was one of quiet pride mixed with a trace of concern. Life hadn't been easy for them. Cynthia worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, but she never let the weight of her burdens overshadow the importance of hope. She had always believed that teaching Amara about patience, perseverance, and self-worth was the most important lesson she could give her. Today was a moment she had hoped for, a small but significant victory. She had watched Amara grow up with a fierce determination that she herself had admired, and now she was witnessing the fruits of that hard work. "Do you have enough, Amara?" Cynthia asked softly, her eyes scanning the aisle. Amara nodded, her face lighting up with joy as she clutched the doll to her chest like a precious prize. She didn't know exactly how much she had saved up, but she had made sure it was enough. Every dollar, every coin, every bit of effort had brought her closer to this moment. And now, standing before the doll, it was all worth it. "I'm going to pay for it now," Amara said with a bright smile, her voice filled with the excitement of a child achieving something monumental. Cynthia smiled back, her heart swelling with love and pride. She had worked hard to make this moment possible, and now it was happening. Amara skipped toward the checkout counter, her small feet tapping lightly against the linoleum floor. As she walked, she caught the eye of the store's security guard, who had been standing near the entrance, watching the crowd with a stern expression. At first, Amara didn't think anything of it. Security guards were a common presence in stores like this. But as she approached the counter, she noticed the guard's gaze seemed fixed on her. His eyes never left her, and for the first time, Amara felt uneasy. Her heart skipped a beat when the guard stepped in front of her, blocking her path with his large frame. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor unapproachable, and his voice was cold, low. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, his gaze piercing. "I'm going to need to check your bag." Amara froze, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the doll. She had no bag. She was just a little girl holding a toy, ready to buy it with the money she had earned. "I don't have a bag," she stammered, holding her empty hands up to show she had nothing to hide. "I was going to pay for this." The guard's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing even further. "Put the doll down," he ordered. Amara's heart raced as she clutched the doll even tighter to her chest, her fingers trembling. This wasn't right. She had worked so hard for this moment, and now it seemed like everything she had done was being questioned. "I'm not stealing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have money. I was going to pay." But the guard didn't budge. He crossed his arms, his tone dismissive. "We've had issues with shoplifting in the past," he said flatly, "and I need to make sure you're not trying to take anything." Tears began to well up in Amara's eyes, not from guilt, but from the humiliation of being accused of something she hadn't done. She had saved for this moment. She had worked for it. This doll was her reward, her symbol of determination, but now she was being treated like a criminal. Before Cynthia could fully process what was happening, the store manager, Mr. Benson, approached. His presence was sharp, his suit impeccable, his face unreadable. He sized up the situation quickly, his eyes flicking between Amara, the guard, and the gathering crowd of onlookers. "What seems to be the problem here?" Mr. Benson asked, his voice formal, exuding authority. The guard quickly turned to him, his voice still rigid but lacking the confidence it had held moments ago. "She was attempting to leave without paying," the guard said, his words hanging in the air. "I wasn't stealing." Amara's voice quivered as she spoke, but she held her ground. "I have money. I was going to pay." Cynthia rushed forward, her protective instincts kicking in. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "Why are you accusing my daughter of stealing?" Mr. Benson's expression remained calm, though a flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, passed through his eyes as he glanced at Amara. "If there's been a misunderstanding, we'll sort it out," he said coolly, though the unease in his voice was palpable. His gaze lingered on Amara for a moment longer than necessary, and Cynthia could see the doubt that had crept into the manager's mind. The worst part, though, was that Cynthia could see it too. The assumption, the judgment that hung in the air, and it was directed at her daughter, at Amara. Amara, standing there with the doll she had worked so hard for, felt her stomach twist in knots. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had saved, she had worked hard. And now, all she could feel was the weight of other people's eyes, judging her. Before the situation could escalate further, a deep voice cut through the growing tension. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was calm but firm, carrying an undeniable authority. Everyone in the store turned to see a tall figure stepping toward them, his presence commanding the room. Dwayne, the Rock Johnson, walked into the store, his casual attire doing little to mask the power that radiated from him. The crowd gasped, and whispers spread like wildfire. But the Rock wasn't here to bask in attention. His focus was solely on the scene before him. The Rock's stand. The moment Dwayne, the Rock Johnson, stepped into the store, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of murmurs in the aisles faded, and all eyes turned toward him. Despite being dressed casually in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, his towering presence filled the room. His steps were measured, each one carrying a weight that seemed to command attention. People instinctively parted to give him space, but it was clear he wasn't there for the usual fanfare. The crowd knew him, but it was his focused expression that made the difference. There was no time for autographs or selfies today. He was here for something much more serious. Amara's heart, already racing with the stress of the situation, skipped another beat. She had seen The Rock on TV, admired him in movies, but now, in real life, he was standing right in front of her. The tall, muscular figure looked down at her with a soft, kind gaze. It was impossible to miss the sense of confidence he exuded, but there was something else about him, something that made her feel, just for a moment, that everything might be okay. "Excuse me," The Rock said, his deep voice calm but firm. He wasn't asking. He was making his presence known. The security guard, who had been standing so rigidly, seemed to freeze for a second, caught off guard by the sudden shift in power. Mr. Benson, the manager, straightened his posture as though trying to regain control of the situation. "What seems to be the problem here?" The Rock asked again, his gaze shifting from the guard to the manager, his expression unreadable, but his words sharp and to the point. The tension in the air grew heavier, and for a brief moment, No one spoke. The security guard cleared his throat and fidgeted nervously, glancing between the two adults and the gathering crowd. The Rock's eyes stayed locked on him, unwavering. The moment stretched, like the calm before a storm. "Well, Mr. Johnson," Mr. Benson said hesitantly, looking around as if searching for the right words. "It seems that this young girl was attempting to leave the store without paying for the doll she's holding." The Rock's brows furrowed slightly, and he took a deliberate step toward the security guard. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice cutting through the awkwardness. "This little girl, who clearly has the money to pay for the doll she's holding, was stopped and accused of stealing. Why exactly?" There was a pause. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, and Mr. Benson adjusted his tie, clearly unprepared for the scrutiny that was now upon him. The Rock's stare was unwavering, and his presence was undeniable. It was as if everything around him faded away, and the only thing that mattered was the truth of the moment. The guard stammered, "Well, we've had some issues with shoplifting in the past, and—" The Rock interrupted him, his tone firm, but not angry. "So what? You're saying that because she's a young black girl, she must be guilty of something? Is that it?" His voice didn't rise in volume, but the intensity of his words left no room for doubt. He wasn't just questioning the actions of the guard. He was challenging the very assumptions that had led to this moment. The security guard looked uneasy, his shoulders stiffening under the weight of the Rock's question. He opened his mouth to speak but then hesitated, clearly unable to justify the situation. The Rock turned toward the manager, his gaze narrowing. "Mr. Benson, you're in charge here, so I'm going to ask you again. Why was this little girl accused of stealing? What evidence did you have that she was doing anything wrong?" The manager's eyes flickered nervously, his mouth opening and closing, unsure of how to respond. We have to be vigilant," he finally said, but there was an unmistakable hesitation in his voice. "We've had incidents in the past." The Rock's response was swift and cutting. "Vigilant means watching everyone, not singling out one child because of the color of her skin. This child was not doing anything wrong, yet she was treated like a criminal. That's not vigilance, that's prejudice. And I'm asking you, what was it about her that made you assume she didn't belong in this store?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. The crowd around them had fallen into a hushed stillness. Amara's eyes were wide, her hands still tightly clutching the doll, as if it might disappear at any moment. She didn't understand everything that was happening, but she knew one thing. The Rock was speaking up for her. In a way, he was standing between her and the unfairness that had almost crushed her. The manager shuffled on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced at the security guard, then back at the Rock. "It's just protocol," he said, his words lacking the conviction they once had. "We can't be too careful." "No," the Rock replied, cutting him off again. "It's not just protocol. It's about common sense, decency, and respect. You assumed that Amara was a thief because of what? Her appearance. You assumed she didn't belong here, didn't deserve the chance to buy that doll she worked so hard for." His gaze shifted to the crowd. "And where were all of you? Watching, whispering, judging without speaking up." His voice didn't rise in anger, but there was an undeniable power in his words. He wasn't just holding the store accountable, he was holding everyone who had witnessed this injustice accountable too. This isn't just about Amara. This is about all the kids who are treated unfairly because of assumptions, because of bias. This is about standing up when we see wrong happening, even if we're not the ones being hurt. The words hung in the air, settling into the hearts of everyone present. Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement, while a few even cast their gazes downward, ashamed of their own passive roles in the situation. Amara stood, still clutching the doll, her small frame trembling but now with a sense of calm. For the first time since the security guard had confronted her, she felt a flicker of hope. The Rock was standing up for her. She wasn't alone. "Cynthia," the Rock said, his gaze softening as he turned to Amara's mother, who had been watching the whole scene unfold with a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" He didn't wait for her reply. He walked toward her, his footsteps sure and steady, his presence offering her a strange comfort. Cynthia, still shaking with the emotion of the moment, nodded. Yes, of course. She took a step forward, still keeping a protective arm around her daughter. The Rock crouched down to Amara's level again, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Hey, Amara," he said gently, his voice low and comforting. "I know this day hasn't gone as planned, but you're stronger than you think. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't let them make you feel small. You stood up for yourself, and that takes a lot of courage." Amara's eyes were wide, the tears from earlier starting to dry. She blinked and nodded slowly. She didn't know how to say it, but her heart swelled with a sense of pride, a feeling she hadn't known she could have at that moment. The Rock stood up and turned back to Mr. Benson, his expression hardening once again. "I think it's time this store does the right thing," he said. "Don't you?" Cynthia, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders, finally spoke. "This isn't just about the doll," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "This is about how you treated my daughter, how you assumed she was a criminal because of the way she looks. That's not acceptable." Mr. Benson's face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't speak. The Rock's stare was piercing, and it was clear that he wasn't going to let this slide without a change. "I think we've had enough of this," the Rock said, his voice rising slightly. "If you want to make this right, you need to do more than just apologize. This store needs to review its policies, make sure your staff is properly trained, and stop this from ever happening again. Not just to Amara, but to any child, any person." The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, now began to murmur in agreement. Some began clapping softly, their applause growing louder with each passing second. As the Rock addressed the crowd, his gaze briefly returned to Amara. "Remember this, kid," he said with a wink. "You're stronger than a lot of people out there. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." For the first time that day, Amara's smile returned. The Rock had not only defended her, but he had also reminded her of something important: her worth. The apology and the promise. The tension in the store slowly began to dissipate, but it was replaced by an overwhelming sense of anticipation. As the crowd murmured and whispered, the weight of the moment seemed to settle upon everyone present. Amara still clutched the doll to her chest, the once vibrant excitement now dulled by the sting of humiliation. But the Rock's words had planted a seed of hope in her heart, a belief that things could be made right. The store manager, Mr. Benson, stood frozen for a moment, his face flushed with discomfort. He had been caught in a moment of deep moral failure, and it was clear to anyone watching that his discomfort was a result of more than just the pressure of the situation. He was now facing a reckoning, not just from the Rock, but from the silent judgment of the people in the store. Every pair of eyes that had been glued to the scene seemed to be silently asking the same question: how could this happen? It was Cynthia, standing close beside her daughter, who broke the silence. "This isn't just about the doll," she said again, her voice no longer shaking with anger, but now filled with a quiet resolve. "It's about how you treated my daughter. You've humiliated her in front of these people and made her feel like she's done something wrong when she hasn't. We work hard for the things we have, and no one, especially a child, should have to feel like this." Mr. Benson seemed to shrink under her words. He had wanted to deflect, to pretend that this was just a simple misunderstanding, but he could no longer avoid the truth. I understand," he stammered. "But we—" "No," the Rock interjected firmly, his voice booming with authority once again. "You don't understand. Not yet. You don't get to just say sorry and move on. An apology is a start, but it's not enough. You need to take responsibility for what's happened here. You need to do something about it." The words hung in the air, each syllable weighted with the gravity of the moment. The crowd stood in hushed silence, listening intently. Even those who had been silently observing now seemed to feel the injustice, their collective understanding shifting. This wasn't just a moment of personal wrongdoing. It was a systemic failure, one that would echo far beyond the walls of this toy store. Mr. Benson swallowed hard. He had underestimated the power of a moment like this. Not only was The Rock, one of the most recognizable figures in the world, standing up for a child who had been wronged, but the people in the store were beginning to shift their gaze from indifference to something far more potent: empathy. The manager cleared his throat, his voice quieter now, laced with a subtle regret. "Amara, I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for what happened here today," he said. His words were clumsy, but they carried the weight of someone who was now, in a small way, coming to terms with the harm they had caused. The Rock stepped forward, his towering figure casting a shadow over the small manager, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's a good start," he said. "But what's next? You don't just get to say sorry and hope it goes away. You need to show that this store, this company, understands the hurt it's caused and is willing to change. You can't just sweep it under the rug. Not today." The manager nodded, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by the slow realization that he had a responsibility not just as an employee, but as a human being. "You're right," he said quietly. We need to do better. I'll make sure we review our policies, get better training for our staff. This isn't just about one child. It's about ensuring that everyone who walks through these doors feels safe and respected. No one should ever feel like this." For the first time, Cynthia allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't much. An apology wasn't a guarantee of change, but it was a step forward. The Rock turned back to Amara, his gaze softening as he crouched down to her level. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice gentle now, as if he were speaking to someone far beyond her years. Amara looked up at him, her eyes wide and still red from the tears. She nodded slowly, the weight of everything that had happened starting to sink in, but she was still processing. The Rock smiled warmly at her, his trademark grin returning. "You know," he said, his voice suddenly light, "I think you just might be the bravest person in this room. You didn't back down. You didn't let them make you feel small. You showed them who you are. You're a fighter, Amara. Don't ever forget that." Amara blinked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She wasn't sure she understood the full weight of his words, but she knew one thing: The Rock believed in her. And that made all the difference. The store, once filled with a quiet, tense murmur, began to stir with a growing sense of change. The manager, though still visibly uncomfortable, seemed to realize that what had just occurred wasn't just a mistake. It was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to set things right, to reflect on the values the store stood for, and to make sure no child would ever feel the way Amara had felt today. "Amara," Mr. Benson said again, his voice softer now. "I know I can't undo what happened here today, but I want to make it right. I want you to have that doll. No charge. It's yours." Amara's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, she was speechless. This was the doll she had saved up for with such determination, the one that had meant so much to her, the one that represented not just a toy, but everything she had worked for. "Really?" she whispered, her voice almost a breath. The manager nodded, his face earnest. "Yes, really." But Cynthia, standing just behind Amara, placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "This isn't just about the doll," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You can give her the doll, but this is about how you treat people, how you treat children, no matter who they are or what they look like." The Rock's gaze shifted to the manager, his expression stern once again. "Listen to her," he said. "This is about respect, about seeing people for who they truly are, not what you assume them to be." Amara, still holding the doll, smiled a small, quiet smile. She felt a weight lifting off her shoulders, the tension that had been building all day slowly fading into something else, a quiet sense of triumph. But the Rock wasn't finished yet. He turned back to the crowd that had gathered, the witnesses to the injustice that had unfolded. His voice rang out with authority, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear, but still filled with warmth. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "When you see something wrong, you stand up. You speak out. This wasn't just about Amara. This is about all the children who feel like they don't belong. This is about making sure we live in a world where no child, no person, is judged for the color of their skin, the way they look, or where they come from." The crowd began to stir again, the whispers rising to a soft murmur of agreement. People began to nod, some even applauding, their applause hesitant at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. This wasn't just a moment of reckoning for the store. It was a wake-up call for everyone present. The Rock glanced at Cynthia and Amara once more, his eyes softening. "You too," he said, his smile returning, "are amazing. And I'll make sure everyone knows it." He turned to the manager one final time. "This store needs to do better. And I'll be watching. So will a lot of other people." As he spoke, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed a credit card to the cashier, his smile mischievous. "And don't just stop at the doll," he said with a wink. "She deserves more than that. Whatever she wants, it's on me." Amara's face lit up as the cashier's eyes widened in surprise. "You really mean it?" she asked, not believing it. The Rock nodded. "Whatever she wants. That's what happens when you work hard and do the right thing. You get rewarded for it." Amara's joy finally began to return, her smile widening as she hugged the doll to her chest, her small hands wrapping around it like it was the most important thing in the world. With the Rock's words, the nightmare of the day was finally over, and the dreams she had worked so hard for were within her grasp again. The day had been hard, but it had also been transformative, a reminder that standing up for what's right could not only change one life, but inspire an entire community to do better. And for Amara, this was just the beginning. The aftermath and the ripple effect. The days that followed the confrontation in the toy store were a blur of emotions for Cynthia and Amara. What had started as a simple, hopeful trip to buy a doll had spiraled into something far larger than either of them could have anticipated. The sense of injustice that had loomed over Amara like a dark cloud slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of validation. For the first time in her young life, Amara understood the weight of her worth, and that someone had stood up to make sure she was seen for who she truly was. The Rock's intervention had done more than just stop an injustice in its tracks. It had sparked a conversation, a much-needed one. The security guard, the manager, and the store itself had been forced to reckon with the assumptions and biases that lay at the heart of their actions. But what they hadn't expected was the ripple effect it would create. Amara's story wasn't just another isolated incident. It was a catalyst for change. It was a reminder that injustice, in any form, must be confronted head-on. As Amara and Cynthia left the store that day, clutching the doll and a small bag of extra treasures purchased by the Rock, they had no idea how the world would react. The moment felt surreal, almost like it had been plucked from the pages of a storybook. But the following morning, as Cynthia checked her phone, the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. Her phone buzzed incessantly, each notification lighting up her screen. There were messages from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers, some of whom she hadn't heard from in years. At first, she thought there had been some kind of mistake, but as she scrolled through her social media feed, her heart skipped a beat. The video of what had happened in the store had already gone viral. It was everywhere. The footage, captured by a bystander, showed Amara holding the doll tightly to her chest, her small body trembling with fear and confusion. The security guard's imposing figure blocked her path, accusing her of stealing, while the Rock stood in defense, questioning the very assumptions that had led to the mistreatment. The video also captured The Rock's impassioned speech about standing up against injustice and the systemic biases that so often go unnoticed. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Amara and hashtag Stand with Amara flooded social media, trending across platforms as people from all walks of life expressed their outrage over the treatment Amara had endured. Comments poured in, from parents sharing their own stories of racial profiling to activists calling for accountability and change. The video had struck a chord with people everywhere, and Amara's story became a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar injustices but had never had the platform or the voice to speak out. For Cynthia, the overwhelming response was both heartwarming and overwhelming. As she read through the comments and messages, she felt a mix of gratitude, disbelief, and awe. She had never expected something like this to happen. Not for herself, not for Amara. She had hoped for a better world, of course, but this was something different. This was a moment that had the power to change hearts and minds on a large scale. Amara's pain, her struggle, had become a symbol of resilience and courage. In the days that followed, Cynthia found herself at the center of a whirlwind. Journalists reached out for interviews, television producers called for appearances, and people from all over the world expressed their support. But it was never about the fame or the attention. Cynthia didn't want Amara to be thrust into the spotlight, not at her age. She wanted to protect her daughter's innocence for as long as possible, shielding her from the relentless barrage of media requests. But Cynthia knew that Amara's story, now shared by so many, was bigger than their personal lives. One afternoon, Cynthia received a call that would change everything. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Hi, this is Maria, Mr. Johnson's assistant. I'm calling to let you know that Mr. Johnson has been following the response to the video, and he wanted to check in on you both. He also wants to set up a meeting with the corporate leadership of the toy store." Cynthia's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. Dwayne, "The Rock" Johnson, hadn't just stepped in to help on the day of the incident. He had remained engaged, following the fallout, and making sure that the toy store took responsibility for its actions. Maria continued, "Mr. Johnson believes the store owes you both a direct apology. He's also working to set up a meeting to discuss what happened and to ensure that they make the necessary changes moving forward." "Thank you," Cynthia said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Please thank Mr. Johnson for everything. This means so much to us." But the call didn't end there. Maria had more news to share. "There's something else," she said. "Some organizations have reached out after hearing Amara's story. There's a scholarship fund being set up in her name, and there are advocacy groups interested in working with her to raise awareness about racial profiling and systemic bias." Cynthia's mind raced. She had always known Amara was special, but she never imagined that this one moment, this one act of courage, would lead to something so significant. The ripple effect was real. It was happening right in front of her. And Amara, still so young, was becoming the face of a movement that would inspire and empower countless others. Meanwhile, Amara, still blissfully unaware of the full impact of her story, had begun to process the kindness she had received. Every time they stepped outside, she noticed the way people looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with admiration. It was subtle but undeniable. She hadn't done anything extraordinary in her eyes. She had simply stood up for herself. But in doing so, she had sparked something bigger than herself. One evening, after a long day of media calls and planning, Cynthia sat down on the couch with Amara. They were quiet for a few moments, the weight of everything that had happened settling in around them. Amara, still clutching her doll, looked up at her mother with wide, innocent eyes. "Mama," she asked hesitantly, "why do so many people want to talk about what happened?" Cynthia hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain the gravity of the situation to her young daughter. Finally, she said, "What happened to you wasn't fair, Amara, and when people see something unfair, they want to make sure it doesn't happen again. Your story is helping them see what needs to change." Amara tilted her head thoughtfully. Does that mean I can help other kids too? Cynthia's heart swelled with pride. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and kissed the top of her head. Yes, Vedi, it means exactly that. You're helping them already. The days passed, and Amara's story continued to spread. News outlets covered the growing movement, highlighting how one child's voice could make a difference in the fight against systemic racism. The scholarship fund in her name grew exponentially, with donations pouring in from individuals, organizations, and even celebrities who had been inspired by her story. Cynthia, feeling a new sense of responsibility, began to lay the groundwork for a nonprofit organization she would call Amara's Light. Its mission was simple yet profound: to combat racial injustice and provide resources for children, families, and communities affected by discrimination. But as much as Cynthia had been thrust into the spotlight, she never let go of her primary focus: protecting Amara's childhood. The media frenzy was overwhelming, and Cynthia turned down most interview requests, keeping her daughter out of the public eye whenever possible. Yet, Amara had begun to understand the significance of her actions. She had always believed that standing up for what's right was important, but now she realized that she was not alone. There were people all over the world who stood with her, people who were ready to fight for change. As the weeks went by, Cynthia found herself standing at the front of a new movement. The outpouring of support had been incredible, but it was only the beginning. The toy store had promised to make changes, to implement new policies, and to ensure that no other child would experience what Amara had. But Cynthia knew that real change required more than just words. It required action, accountability, and a commitment to creating a more just and inclusive world for all children. And as she watched Amara, now more confident and determined than ever, she knew that this was just the start of something much larger, a movement that would continue to grow, to inspire, and to change lives. Because Amara's light had already begun to shine, and it was brighter than anyone had ever imagined. The corporate reckoning. The aftermath of Amara's story continued to unfold in ways Cynthia could never have anticipated. What had been a small private moment of injustice had grown into a global conversation about race, fairness, and the importance of speaking out against prejudice. Amara's name had become a symbol, and now it was time for the very corporation that had been complicit in the incident to face the consequences. The phone call Cynthia had received from Maria, the Rock's assistant, was just the beginning. The support from the Rock and the widespread outcry had forced the toy store's corporate leadership to take action. What started as a humble, quiet apology in the store was quickly turning into a full corporate reckoning. The toy store, one of the largest chains in the country, was no longer just dealing with an isolated incident. It was facing the reality of public scrutiny, media coverage, and the urgent need to change. As the days passed, Cynthia received another call, this time from Maria, confirming a private meeting had been scheduled with the toy store's executives. The meeting would take place in their corporate office, a sleek, high-rise building that seemed so far removed from the store where Amara had been humiliated. The company's CEO, a polished man named Richard Albright, had personally requested the meeting. He had heard the public outcry, the online backlash, and most importantly, the voices of the people calling for accountability. It was time to make things right. The day of the meeting arrived, and Cynthia, still overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation, dressed in her best suit, ready to represent her daughter and the countless others who had been affected by racial profiling. Amara, though still a child, insisted on attending. She didn't fully understand the weight of the meeting, but she knew it was important. She knew her actions had sparked something much bigger than herself, and for that, she was proud. Cynthia, with Amara by her side, entered the corporate building with a sense of purpose. The lobby was polished and pristine, a far cry from the cluttered aisles of the toy store where Amara had been accused of theft. They were ushered into an elegant conference room where the executives were already seated, waiting for them. There was a certain stiffness in the air, a tension that made Cynthia's heart race. She had seen this kind of corporate coldness before. She had worked in retail, and she knew how these meetings could go. Empty apologies, rehearsed speeches, and promises that never materialized. But this time, Cynthia wasn't going to let that happen. As she sat across from Richard Albright, the CEO, she noticed the weight of his gaze. He was a man accustomed to power, but today he seemed uncomfortable. His eyes flickered nervously between Cynthia and Amara, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Miss Thompson," Richard Albright began, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. "I want to start by sincerely apologizing for the incident that took place in our store. What happened to your daughter was unacceptable. We understand that, and we're committed to making things right." Cynthia remained silent for a moment, allowing the CEO's words to sink in. She had heard this before, the rehearsed apology. But she wasn't here for words. She was here to see action. She turned to look at Amara, whose small hands were gripping her doll tightly, the weight of the moment slowly sinking in. "Thank you for the apology," Cynthia finally said, her voice calm but firm. "But an apology isn't enough. You humiliated my daughter in front of a store full of people. You made assumptions about her based on the color of her skin, and you treated her like she was guilty of something she hadn't done." Richard Albright's face flushed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Cynthia continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "It's not just about Amara. It's about every child who is judged before they even get the chance to speak. It's about every family that is treated with suspicion, simply because of the way they look. We're talking about a systemic issue, one that affects millions of people, not just in your store, but in this country. And I'm not here to listen to a few empty promises. I'm here to make sure that your company takes real steps to ensure that this never happens again." The room fell silent. Cynthia's words hung in the air, each one weighted with a lifetime of experience, of injustice, and of resilience. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter. She was fighting for every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or stereotyped. Finally, Richard Albright spoke, his voice no longer the smooth, practiced tone from before. "You're right, Miss Thompson. What happened to your daughter was part of a much larger problem. And while I can't undo the past, I can assure you that we're taking immediate action. We're reviewing our policies, implementing new diversity and anti-bias training for all of our staff, and conducting a complete audit of our store practices. We want to ensure that no one, especially children, ever feels the way your daughter did in our store." Cynthia listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the sincerity behind them. There was something different in Albright's tone now, something that suggested he was beginning to understand the gravity of what he was facing. The pressure was mounting, and the public was watching. The Rock had not just spoken out for Amara. He had placed the store on notice. They were now accountable to the world. But Cynthia wasn't ready to let this meeting end with promises. "I'm glad you're taking steps in the right direction," she said slowly. "But actions speak louder than words. Your company needs to show that it's serious about this. That means going beyond training sessions and reviews. It means making sure that your policies actively protect your customers, especially children. You need to do more than apologize. You need to be transparent about the changes you're making, and you need to follow through." Richard Albright nodded, clearly taking her words to heart. "You're absolutely right. We are committed to transparency. We will publish our findings from the audits, and we'll provide regular updates on the progress we're making. We know this is a long-term commitment, not just a one-time fix." Cynthia glanced down at Amara, who had been listening intently. There was a quiet wisdom in her daughter's eyes, a reflection of the strength she had gained from this entire experience. And now, in this room, Amara was once again being asked to be the face of something larger than herself. Amara looked up at the CEO, her voice soft but clear. "Will the other kids be safe now?" she asked, her words simple but profound. The room fell completely still. Every person in that conference room, from the CEO to the executives and the support staff, was caught off guard by the directness of Amara's question. It was a child's question, but it cut to the heart of the matter. Will this company change? Will they do what they've promised? Will they make sure that no other child has to experience the fear, the shame, the doubt that Amara had? Richard Albright's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "Yes, Amara," he said, his voice gentler now. "We are doing everything we can to make sure that all kids are safe. We are working to make sure that everyone, no matter who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." Cynthia's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything she wanted, and it certainly wasn't going to undo what had happened to her daughter. But it was a start. A real, tangible start. As the meeting wrapped up, Cynthia knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. The toy store's leadership had made a commitment, but the true test would come in the weeks and months that followed. Would they live up to their promises? Would they continue to prioritize diversity and inclusion? Would the changes they promised actually take root? The Rock had made it clear that he would be watching, and so would the world. As they left the corporate building, Cynthia took Amara's hand. They had done what they set out to do. They had forced the company to take responsibility, to acknowledge their mistakes, and to commit to real change. It was a victory, but it was just one step on a much longer path. The journey for Amara, for Cynthia, and for all those who had been touched by their story was far from over. And as they walked out of the building, hand in hand, they knew that the light Amara had sparked was just beginning to shine, and its glow would continue to grow, illuminating a path toward a more just and equitable world. A movement grows. The days after the meeting at the corporate headquarters felt like a blur for Cynthia and Amara. They had taken a significant step in confronting the injustice that had nearly robbed Amara of her joy, and in the process, they had ignited something much larger. What had begun as a personal struggle, a mother and daughter standing up against the mistreatment of a child, had blossomed into a movement, one that transcended race, age, and background. As Cynthia prepared for the next phase of their journey, she reflected on how far they had come. The toy store had begun implementing its changes, and the promised diversity and anti-bias training for staff had already been scheduled. Cynthia had been cautiously optimistic about the company's commitment, but she knew that actions spoke louder than words. She was determined to hold them accountable, but she also knew the journey didn't end there. She was more focused now than ever on using Amara's story as a platform to address the larger issues of racial profiling, bias, and discrimination that still permeated society. Cynthia had always known Amara was special. She had watched her daughter grow from a young girl with a fierce sense of ambition to someone who understood the importance of standing up for what was right. But she never could have imagined that Amara's quiet determination, the strength that had driven her to save up for a doll, would touch the hearts of so many people around the world. As the video of Amara's encounter at the toy store continued to circulate, the reaction was overwhelming. It wasn't just people from their community or even the country that responded. It was people from across the globe. Thousands of messages poured in from people who had seen the footage and were moved by the bravery of a small child standing up for herself, despite the weight of the world trying to push her down. Amara became a symbol of resistance. Her name was no longer just tied to that one afternoon of humiliation, but had evolved into a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless against the systems of injustice they faced daily. What started with a single video had sparked a global conversation, one that would continue to grow and shape the future. The Rock had been the catalyst, but it was Amara's unwavering spirit that had inspired the world. One morning, as Cynthia scrolled through social media, she came across a new hashtag that had been trending. Hashtag #AmaraSlight. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she read through the stories that people were sharing. The hashtag was being used by activists, educators, and parents who wanted to honor the courage and strength Amara had shown in the face of adversity. People were using it to share their own experiences with racial profiling, with bias in everyday life, and their commitment to making sure children, of all backgrounds, felt safe and valued. It wasn't just Amara's light that was shining now. It had become a collective light, illuminating the path toward a future free from discrimination. It was during this time that Cynthia realized something truly transformative was happening. What had once been an isolated incident of injustice had grown into a larger call for change. And it wasn't just Amara's voice that was being heard. It was the voices of all the children and families who had experienced similar discrimination. The world was waking up, and people were finally speaking out about the issues that had been ignored for far too long. Soon after, Cynthia was invited to speak at a conference on racial justice and advocacy, and she knew it was the perfect opportunity to amplify the movement that had grown around Amara's story. As the day of the conference approached, Amara became more and more curious about the attention they were receiving. She asked questions about the people who wanted to talk to them, the organizations that were reaching out, and the events they were attending. Cynthia, always protective of her daughter's innocence, knew this was an important moment in her daughter's life. It was a chance for Amara to realize the impact she was having on the world, to understand that her story wasn't just about one person. It was about the collective voice of countless others who were demanding justice. The day of the conference arrived, and Cynthia stood at the podium, speaking to a room full of activists, educators, and community leaders. Amara, sitting in the front row, clutched her doll to her chest, her legs crossed beneath her. She was quiet, but there was a confidence in the way she held herself. She understood the importance of the moment. Cynthia looked out into the audience, seeing the faces of so many people who had been touched by Amara's story. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady and resolute. When my daughter Amara walked into that store, she was just a little girl, full of hope and excitement. She was going to buy the doll she had worked so hard for. But in a split second, her joy turned into humiliation as she was accused of something she hadn't done, simply because of the color of her skin. And while I am forever grateful that we had someone like Dwayne Johnson step in and speak out for us, the truth is that Amara's story is not unique. This is a story that has been repeated countless times in this country, in this world, by children who have been made to feel that they are other. Cynthia paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. She could see the nods of agreement, the faces filled with understanding. But it's time for that to change. It's time for us to recognize the power we all have to stand up against injustice, no matter how small or large the act may seem. We are the ones who can make a difference. We are the ones who have the power to shape a future where no child is judged by the color of their skin. A future where every child, no matter where they come from or what they look like, is given the opportunity to dream, to be free of fear, and to be valued. Amara's eyes sparkled as she listened to her mother's words. She had become a part of something much larger than herself. The applause that followed Cynthia's speech was thunderous, but it wasn't just for her. It was for every person in that room who had committed to making a change, to ensuring that Amara's story would never be forgotten. Later that evening, Cynthia and Amara sat in their hotel room, exhausted but filled with a sense of fulfillment. Amara hugged her doll close to her chest, and Cynthia smiled at her daughter's quiet strength. "You did so well today, Amara," Cynthia said, her voice soft. Amara looked up, her eyes wide with wonder. "Do you think I really helped?" Cynthia nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. You've helped more people than you can imagine. Your story has given so many others the courage to share theirs. You've started something, Amara. You've lit a fire that's going to keep burning." Amara smiled, her heart light. "I'm just happy I got my doll," she said with a giggle, her innocence shining through. Cynthia laughed, pulling her daughter into a hug. "And you've got so much more than that. You've got a legacy now, Amara. A legacy of courage, of standing up for what's right. And that legacy is going to keep growing." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Cynthia reflected on how far they had come. The moment in the toy store that had seemed so devastating had led them to this. It had led them to a movement that wasn't just about one child or one family. It was about every person who had ever felt the sting of judgment, the weight of assumptions placed upon them, and the fear of being misunderstood. And as Amara's light continued to grow, Cynthia knew that their journey was far from over. They had started something that would carry on for generations to come, a movement grounded in love, in justice, and in the unshakable belief that no one should ever feel like they don't belong. The world had heard Amara's story, and it was forever changed because of it. The ripple effect that had begun with one brave little girl's courage had already begun to create waves of change that would echo far beyond anything they could have imagined. The path toward justice was long, but with every step they took, they were lighting the way for others to follow. And as Amara held her doll close, her heart full of pride, she knew she had not just fought for herself, she had fought for the future, a future where every child, every person, could stand tall and proud, knowing that they were enough.